The term gunfighter is used heavily in discussions of the Wild West. This is despite the word being a general phrase meant to describe a number of professions and lifestyles on the western frontier. Back in the Old West, gunfighter could mean ranchers and cowboy archetypes you see in artistic representations of the time period. It could also relate to the polar opposites. Both lawmen and outlaws alike were forms of gunfighters, always armed and ready for a show, either for the greater good or the selfish bad. Gunfighters were also men, and sometimes women, who were otherwise members of everyday industries, such as farmers or teamsters, which were the drivers of the wagons, stagecoaches, and after the turn of the 20th century, automobiles. Even folks stuck with the labels of conman and gambler were referred to generally as gunfighters, people who could defend themselves when their vice of choice led them into murkier waters. Of all the professions spanning all the industries, the most fascinating subgroup of gunfighters was the bounty hunters, men dispatched by both the government and powerful entities who venture out across the land in search of a man or woman who owes someone else money or other goods. While bounty hunting wasn't as popular a career as many Hollywood films and tales of the Wild West would suggest, it was a way for some of the most experienced and isolated gunfighters to make a living, while using their talents to the best of their abilities. To cover these intriguing and incendiary figures of Western frontier lore, here's the next video in our series of both famous and infamous bounty hunters, continuing with the legendary Pinkerton detective and bounty hunter, Charles Siringo. Charles Angelo Siringo was born on February 7, 1855, on a small spit of land called the Matagorda Peninsula of Matagorda County, roughly located along the southeastern coastlines of Texas. He was the second child to Antonio and Bridget White Siringo, coming after his old sister, Catherine Siringo, born a year prior in 1854. Catherine and Charles' parents were European immigrants, both coming from notable corners across the pond. Antonio was an Italian transplant who came to America from the city of Genoa, while Bridget hailed from Ireland before immigrating to New Orleans in 1849. The first year of Charles' life was filled with hardships. About 6 to 7 months after his son was christened in Brazoria, Texas, Antonio Siringo died when Charles was only a year old, leaving behind Bridget to take care of their 2 toddlers. Bridget, along with the assistance of relatives and close friends around Matagorda, kept their little family afloat over the next few years. Once Charles was of school age, he was sent away to public school, right around the time of the onset of the American Civil War. In 1867, at the age of 12, Charles received the opportunity to take on cowpuncher lessons for the first time, the launching pad to his future illustrious career as a ranch hand. However, he wouldn't quite break free from public schooling for another few years. During this time, Charles spent considerable hours in both Mississippi and St. Louis, where his mother Bridget finally remarried. Soon after, he traveled to New Orleans, where he'd round out his academic education at the Fisk Public Schools on the Bayou. At the age of 15, Charles Siringo returned to the Lone Star State and found consistent work as a cowhand on local area ranches. One such locale was the Coastal Plain Ranches owned and operated by famous Texans Joseph Hemans and W.B. Grimes. In 1871, Charles connected with one of Grimes' protégés and legacy cowboys, Abel H. Shanghai Pierce, himself a descendant of the Pilgrims on the Mayflower. Shanghai Pierce taught Charles everything he knew about cowpunching, showing him the ropes, literally, on his Rancho Grande, located close to present-day Blessing, Texas. Charles was also instructed by Pierce's brother, Jonathan Edwards. After half a decade learning everything there was to learn about the art of being a cowboy, Charles took on independent work as a trusted cattle driver. In 1876, he was awarded the position of lead trail driver, where he successfully drove a herd of 2,500 longhorns from Austin, Texas to Kansas, utilizing the Chisholm Trail. After the fruit of Charles' labor reached the ears of fellow ranchers all across the Lone Star State, his itinerary only grew. In 1877, a second trip into Wyoming and the surrounding territories was underway after esteemed cattleman George W. Littlefield hired him to dispatch a second herd along the western branch of the Chisholm Trail. That same year, on a sweltering summer afternoon in Dodge City, Kansas, Charles came face to face with the legendary lawman, scout, and gambler Bartholomew William Masterson, better known by his moniker Bat Masterson. Masterson was the recently elected undersheriff to Sheriff Charles Bassett of Dodge City, and worked alongside the assistant marshal and none other than Wyatt Earp. It just so happened that Siringo was in town the same day as the legendary dust-up between Earp, Masterson, and the violent gunfighter Clay Allison. The story, often told from Earp's perspective, goes that Allison was on another rage-tilted bender and was stirring up a confrontation in Dodge City that was likely to turn bloody. Earp claims that he and Masterson were left with no choice but to hold Allison back and physically restrain him from becoming violent once more. However, Siringo would later write about the infamous incident, claiming Earp and Masterson took credit for the cooldown, when it was in fact two anonymous businessmen of Dodge City that kept Clay Allison's fiery temper at bay. Other witnesses would tend to agree with Siringo, more so than Earp's own testimony. While Charles avoided any fallout from witnessing the Masterson-Allison conflict, his time in Dodge City wasn't without results. During his stay, the burgeoning cowboy met two agriculture entrepreneurs, David Beals and W.H. Deacon Bates from Boston. Beals and Bates offered Charles an opportunity to sign on to their cattle operation and drive a herd from Dodge City down to the panhandle of Texas. Awaiting them was the newly formed LX Ranch, where the two Bostonian businessmen offered Charles a more permanent position of employment. Over the course of a few years, he lived on the LX Ranch and worked as a full-time cowpuncher, meeting various ranch hands and like-minded cowboys who passed through the panhandle on business. One such traveler was a young man named Henry McCarty, better known today by his infamous moniker of Billy the Kid. Charles and Billy the Kid were never close, but they'd forever be linked through history, after the latter was caught rustling cattle from the LX Ranch sometime in 1880. Charles Siringo and a ragtag team of fellow gunfighting cowhands were quickly dispatched to chase down Billy the Kid and bring him back to Texas, where he'd be placed in the hands of justice. For weeks, Charles and his posse of amateur bounty hunters scaled the red rock and dusty dry plains of New Mexico for any sign of Billy the Kid. Unfortunately for them, Billy the Kid was one of the most elusive and slippery outlaws that side of the Mississippi. The land of enchantment proved to be too vast for a group of young cowboys to conquer without the proper experience to guide them, and they returned to the panhandle empty-handed and with a scoffed ego. For Charles, however, the opportunity to chase down a notorious criminal proved inspirational beyond just the task. He was surprised by his affinity for the search across the frontier and his natural ability to lead a manhunt into uncharted territory. Nevertheless, Siringo returned to Texas and drove cattle for another few years until he met the first love of his life, Mamie Lloyd. The couple wed in 1884 and said goodbye to the Lone Star State, moving to a modest residence in Caldwell, Kansas, where Siringo would open up a tobacco shop. On the final day of February 1885, Siringo and Mamie welcomed their first child into the world, a daughter named Viola. With more time spent at home, the former cowboy decided to write about his life and times driving stock and working as a ranch hand in Texas. That year, these accounts were published as Siringo's first autobiography, titled A Texas Cowboy, or 15 Years on the Hurricane Deck of a Spanish Pony. A second edition was printed the year following in 1886. The memoir would eventually take the country by storm, giving readers one of the earliest accounts of life in the Wild West. It was one of the first books to popularize the American frontier as a land of adventure and intrigue, and launched Siringo's status as a legendary figure of US lore. Little did everyone know, his story was about to take an entirely new direction. In 1886, while enjoying the spoils of a successful publication, Charles Siringo looked upon his Caldwell, Kansas keep and realized he needed yet another change in scenery. To account for this desire, he and his family packed up and moved to Chicago, Illinois, a much more modern locale, benefiting from a complete transformation during the Industrial Revolution 4 decades prior. In May of '86, and not long after the Siringos graced the Windy City with their presence, machinists and other union supporters were rallying at the Haymarket Square in support of a mandated 8-hour working day. On May 3rd, 2 workers from the McCormick Harvesting Machine Company were killed by police during an attempt to make contact with strikebreakers outside of the plant. The following day, during a strike rally estimated to include upwards of 3,000 union members, an anonymous insurgent tossed dynamite into the police barricades. Both the explosion itself and gunfire by the police ended up killing 7 officers, 4 civilians, and wounding countless others. Charles Siringo is said to have witnessed the altercation and paid close attention to the ensuing investigation by Chicago PD. Harkening back to his days hunting down Billy the Kid in the Old West, Siringo longed for the thrill of detective work again, inspired by the sleuths around Chicago. Thus, he set up a visit at the Pinkerton National Detective Agency and used Pat Garrett's name on his application to fake a reference. Technically, Siringo had run into Pat Garrett during his quest to track down the kid, but never quite made the connection he stated that he made. Nevertheless, it didn't matter in the end, as Siringo's resume was accepted and approved by Pinkerton officials, and the former cowboy became a newfound cowboy detective. His first assignment took Siringo across the wide Missouri and all the way back west to Denver, Colorado. He was stationed there under the supervision of notable labor spy and Pinkerton stalwart James McParland. McParland was in town to investigate the abuse experienced by clients at the hand of poorly managed Pinkerton detectives. And when proof was brought to Alan Pinkerton's sons, everyone in the Denver office was fired, except for McParland and Siringo. In 1890, Mamie Siringo passed away, and as a result, the Siringo family was forever fractured. Their daughter Viola was sent to live with her great-aunt and uncle, Will and Emma Reed. In the aftermath, Siringo could focus solely on his detective duties with Pinkerton and venture off across the frontier. One of his first assignments saw him trek all the way north to the Treadwell Mine of Juneau, Alaska. The next took him in the opposite direction, on a 4,000-mile journey south all the way to Mexico City. And on the job sandwiched somewhere in between, Siringo was known for being one of the first detectives to investigate undercover. Cattle rustlers and small-time robbers had no chance to fool the burgeoning bounty hunter, and the successful arrest numbers started to climb. When Siringo wasn't on the road and traversing the frontier, though, he was secluded in the Denver Pinkerton outpost, where his biggest nemesis, paperwork and records keeping, about made the cowboy detective go mad. To get out of the office and into the field, Siringo made acquaintances with Tom Horn, a fellow Pinkerton known for his sharpshooting and tracking skills. Horn impressed his part-time partner, his scouting abilities unrivaled throughout the West. At the same time, Horn harbored a seedy dark side that quietly worried Siringo. In his writings in retirement, the cowboy detective would remark on Horn's underlying darkness that could seemingly be activated by the flip of an unseen switch. In 1891, Siringo took part in one of his most noteworthy undercover campaigns, when he fabricated the identity of one Charles T. Leon to assist New Mexico Governor L. Bradford Prince in a major assassination attempt. Only, it wasn't Governor Prince himself who was the target, but rather local businessman Elias Stover, state politician Thomas Catron, and a few others. See, members from the Knights of Labor and Las Gorras Blancas, a labor union and anti-squatting vigilante squad respectively, had attempted to assassinate these high-ranking officials in response to growing tensions across the land of enchantment. Ultimately, the investigation didn't live to see the light of day, and the insurgents were never arrested, as Siringo was ordered to drop the case before he could collect the evidence he needed to support any arrests. Nonetheless, Siringo's appointment in New Mexico wasn't without purpose, as he ended up purchasing around 250 acres of Santa Fe land that would eventually become Sunny Slope Ranch. On the farm was a 2-room adobe, with a window overlooking the Sangre de Cristo mountain range. Once his time in New Mexico came to a close, Siringo was then dispatched to the Silver Valley mines on the Idaho Panhandle. The assignment was at first rejected by the detective, due to the sympathetic bias he had towards the Mine Owners Protective Association. McParland understood Siringo's reservations, but asked that he feast his eyes upon the situation first before making a final judgment. Laboring away as an undercover shoveler in the gem mine of Silver Valley, Siringo, now under the moniker of Charles Allison, realized the Union had been taken over by violent anarchists, and the peaceful protests were sure to turn deadly. Siringo remained on the Idaho Panhandle for another year, collecting vital evidence during the Idaho labor strike of 1892, and eventually testified to convict upwards of 18 Union officials who were culpable in the corruption. As the calendar flipped to 1893, Siringo's home life took another transforming turn. That year, he married a woman named Lily Thomas, bearing a child together another few years later in 1896. This time they gave birth to a son, named William Lee Roy. While Charles and Lily's life together started harmoniously, it quickly became apparent their marriage would reach an impasse. Lily desperately wanted to move further west and live on the coasts of Los Angeles, California. Meanwhile, Siringo was still deeply devoted to the Pinkertons and couldn't facilitate a truce. They divorced the same year William was born. For the next few years, Siringo took on countless cases without reservation. Growing more and more comfortable by the day, the cowboy detective notched at least 100 arrests during this time. His name was synonymous with success at every Pinkerton outpost across the West. In 1899, his biggest assignment to date would be handed down by the top brass at the detective agency. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, the dynamic duo ahead of the Wild Bunch gang, were a top priority to Pinkerton and bounty hunters at large. Taking on disguises of Tony Lloyd, Harry Blevins, and a runaway Mexican outlaw named Charles L. Carter, Siringo found various ways to connect with Cassidy and company. This epic operation lasted a lengthy 4 years, and saw Siringo journey over 25,000 collective miles through 2 continents and various countries. While the cowboy detective wasn't solely responsible for bringing an end to the Wild Bunch, he and his reignited relationship with his former partner, Tom Horn, aided lawmen in the pursuit. It's often said that the efforts of Charles Siringo prevented additional thievery and bloodshed from taking place. To hear a more in-depth retelling of Siringo's pursuit of the Wild Bunch, make sure to check out our feature documentary covering the case of Butch Cassidy's criminal enterprise. The cowboy detective's assignments were fewer and far between after the turn of the century. When the hunt for Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid died off, Siringo returned to the frontier to hunt down outlaw stragglers as the Old West's heyday came to a close. One of his final major cases came in 1907, when his sleuthing skills were traded in for protective services. Bill Haywood was standing trial for the Western Federation of Miners after Albert Horsley, the man Siringo was to protect, assassinated the governor of Idaho, Frank Steunenberg. A not guilty verdict was handed in, and a lynch mob swiftly formed in hopes to hang Haywood and others associated with the WFM. Siringo caught wind of the insurgency and alerted the new standing Idaho governor, Frank Gooding, of these plans. To some, it was a betrayal of the Pinkertons by Siringo, who had devoted the previous 20 years or so to the detective agency. You see, the fact of the matter was, he was always sitting on the fence between his Pinkerton loyalty and sympathies to unions across the country. These feelings evidently weren't ever completely squashed, as he eventually helped protect Bill Haywood's attorney, Clarence Darrow, from the aforementioned lynch mob thirsty for a hanging. The same year, Charles Siringo would resign from the Pinkertons once and for all. After the cowboy detective's final days as a bounty hunter came to a close, he attempted to settle down for a third time, marrying a woman named Grace while taking the occasional assignment from the William J. Burns Detective Agency. Neither fling lasted long, though, and in 1909, the marriage ended with a divorce, and Siringo himself ended up back in New Mexico at his Sunny Slope Ranch. Home again on his parcel of land north of Arroyo Chamizo, Siringo took to the pen once more and wrote a second autobiography, this one titled Pinkerton's Cowboy Detective. Of course, the book wouldn't be published without controversy, as the officials at Pinkerton caught wind of the memoir and blocked its release. They felt it violated the confidentiality agreements signed by Siringo when he had first joined the detective agency. Siringo was proud of his work, however, and didn't go down silently. Rather, he simply changed the title of the book and edited a few names, places, and events to avoid a lawsuit by the Pinkertons. Thus, in 1912, A Cowboy Detective was first published and took the country by storm. Enough so that Siringo met and married his fourth wife, this time to Ellen Partain. Much like his previous attempts at romance, though, their vows fell through, and Siringo would live out his final days as a single man. To combat the solitary sadness, Siringo continued on writing about his exploits as a bounty hunter and lawman. Chafed by Pinkerton's involvement in his previous book, and their involvement with union busting in total, Siringo's next work was called Two Evil Isms, Pinkertonism and Anarchism. These testimonies were much more damning than his previous penmanship, detailing the voter fraud schemes and mass deception put on by Pinkerton's finest. This included the attempted fraud of the re-election of former Colorado Governor James Peabody. To no one's surprise, the Pinkertons came down even harder on Siringo's third installment on his Chronicles of Life Out West. They not only suppressed the wide release of the book, but they went as far as to file a criminal arrest warrant for libel. Siringo was never extradited, however, thanks to the assistance of New Mexico Governor William McDonald. It goes without saying, Charles Siringo never stepped foot in Chicago again. In 1916, Siringo scratched his itch to get back into bounty hunting and joined the New Mexico Mounted Patrol to track down rustlers still plaguing the land of enchantment. For 2 years, the former cowboy rode through the Red Rock Plains, enjoying the thrill as the sun set over his career as a detective. In 1918, Siringo retired due to his failing health, having to surrender his Sunny Slope Ranch as he was no longer able-bodied to take care of the property, let alone rich enough to pay someone else to do it. With the money from the sale, Siringo scurried further west to Los Angeles, California, where he determined that Hollywood could keep him afloat. Of course, the obsession with the Wild West era was only just beginning in show business, and the cowboy detective enjoyed his time in the spotlight while he could, rekindling his connection with the legendary Wyatt Earp. In 1920, the next in Siringo's line of books was published, called History of Billy the Kid, and harkened back to his days chasing the youthful outlaw deep into the frontier. Over the next half-decade, Siringo's film credits ranged from Nine Scars Make a Man and Tumbleweeds. His final book publication came in 1927, called Riata and Spurs. This edition was a conglomerate of stories told in previous writings, and was unsurprisingly blocked by the Pinkerton agency. They revised enough of the content that the final product ended up being more fiction than fact, much like the tales of the Old West turned out anyway. A year later, Charles Siringo finally gave way to dwindling physical health, and died on October 18, 1928, in Altadena, California. The cowboy detective would forever be known as the ranch hand turned lawman turned bounty hunter, once devoted to the cause of Pinkerton before ultimately evolving into a Union sympathizer. He wasn't afraid to call out those who deserved justice, and died a lonely man as a result. He was a gunfighter who rarely resorted to violence, and spent the better part of life removing such calamity from the world, as best as he could at least. Charles Siringo will be a fascinating figure of not just Old West lore, but of United States history, from here unto eternity. He was a complicated hero who simply wanted to live life with a story to tell. And it goes without saying, such stories were of no short supply for the legendary cowboy detective.